Hundreds of millions of people are training martial arts wrong. You can do better. And in this video, I'm gonna prove it. I thought I had a solid grasp on the most effective ways to develop skill in grappling after 8 years of serious jiu-jitsu and a decade of teaching movement. That changed when I heard about a revolutionary approach from a BJJ expert. Intrigued, I flew out for an interview. What I saw in his classes was astonishing. Hobbyists and teenagers were performing with a level of skill that defied their experience. They were learning at a pace I'd never seen in all my years of grappling. This wasn't just a different way to train. It was and is a fundamental shift in how we understand skill development. That inspired me to spend the last 8 months working on this video, digging into this new approach that I believe will not only change the way you see the world, but will revolutionize BJJ and movement training as we know it. I've distilled over 1,000 hours of rigorous research for this video, devouring every major book and article on the subject from the last 25 years, engaging with top researchers, and moving across the country to train relentlessly with this new vanguard of jiu-jitsu. This video is a distillation of everything I've learned, a concise, actionable guide to help you both understand and apply this transformative approach. By the end of this video, you should be able to understand both ecological dynamics and its primary methods, the CLA and differential learning. You'll know the pros and cons of using these new approaches over traditional ones. You'll understand direct perception and how it contrasts with the traditional information processing model. You'll understand how two of the best BJJ coaches in the world, John Danaher and Greg Souders, might actually have more similarities than differences in their teaching, despite using those contrasting paradigms. You'll get a strategic guide to immediately use the CLA to learn the fundamentals of jiu-jitsu in a far more effective way. And hopefully, you'll start to understand how you can apply all of this to any area of movement that you want to learn or teach. If you leave this video with a similar view of how we move through the world, it's because you already knew everything, or because you didn't pick up what I'm about to put down. So, to fully grasp this approach, watch this video in its entirety, then revisit challenging sections and take notes. From there, dive into the practical exercises and recommended resources to begin integrating these concepts into your training. Every word of the 12,728 words in this video has been carefully chosen to maximize the accuracy and clarity of these ideas. Give this material your full attention and it will transform your practice, whether you've never grappled before or you're already a world champion. Before we get into the science, I want to introduce you to someone whose success in grappling serves as a hard proof of concept for this new approach. I could tell you about DeAndre Corbet, who, after 12 years of training, had earned his black belt, but had no major competitive success until he started using this new approach. And in the last 4 years, went from getting leg locked by blue belts at standard to an undefeated run at ADCC West Coast Trials, defeating multiple black belt world champions with no points scored against him, while also being a full-time engineer for the Navy. But DeAndre is easily one of the most disciplined, intelligent, and hard-working people I've ever met. You could argue that he would have had success even if he followed the traditional approach. I could tell you about Noah Schaffner, an 18-year-old kid who's trained exclusively with this approach for just 3 years and submitted black belts as a white belt. But Noah's been single-mindedly focused on jiu-jitsu for those 3 years, with the goal of becoming a world champion. But many gyms across the world have child prodigies. And while that is exceptional with the power of youth, focus, and now a full-time schedule, Noah could have become a fearsome grappler at any competitive gym. Instead, I want you to meet my friend, Josh Fan. Josh is 38 years old and married with a 2-year-old son. In 2013, he decided to try his first jiu-jitsu class.
The sequences they were doing were super complicated, and it was these 10-step moves, and I could not for the life of me move around. I was like, this is horrible.
10 years later, when his work finally settled down, he decided to try again. He Googled gyms and went to the first one that popped up, Standard Jiu-Jitsu. At Standard, they don't drill techniques at all, let alone 10-step sequences. Great. Josh still had a hard time, but he was hooked.
My first class year was an extreme challenge. I probably didn't win a single exchange for a year. And so, shoot, I was about to quit because I sucked so bad. My first year of jiu-jitsu was pretty tough on my body, starting pretty late in my 30s, tennis elbow, golf elbow, lower back pain, all that kind of stuff. So I was mainly constraining my training to about 3 times a week. And then about after the year mark, I started training 4 to 5 days a week, every week.
He also had to take a combined year away from the mat for various reasons. So how do you think Josh would do against me? I recently got engaged, but I'm no family man. I'm an obsessive movement teacher.
This is where I used to sleep, right here.
I have many friends who are Josh's physical and grappling experience equivalent, and I could beat all of them 5 years ago. I've been grappling for 3 times as long, sometimes twice a day. And physically, I'm no freak athlete, but I'm not too far away. Further, the difference in our knowledge about grappling is enormous. I spent years falling asleep to the voice of John Danaher, and last year I taught a 15-hour grappling workshop from memory. Josh barely knows the names for some of the most basic moves and positions. Now, watch as I get mauled by a 38-year-old basketball coach.
They call Noah purebred. They call me old bred here, but I'm purebred as well.
Josh beats me in the grip fight, then uses that advantage to catch a single leg. Then spends the next 2 minutes hashing my guard and pinning me until I can finally stand up. Then he works his way to a Kimura grip and transitions to the armbar. I manage to pull my elbow out, but he transitions to a triangle on the other arm and submits me with my own favorite move, the triangle armbar. Now, it should be obvious that Josh is a very good grappler, and insanely good for his experience level. I'm not going to try to pretend Josh is a normal guy. Josh is amazing. I have enormous respect for him, but Josh is not a freak athlete. In fact, when he walked into standard for the first time, he was a very averagely athletic 35-year-old guy. But I can name many moves I can't do, while Josh can do many moves he can't name. Why? Why was he able to beat me so badly? And why are there so many people at this gym making such outsized progress? And why, 6 months after that video, is Josh scared to record a rematch with me?
Gonna be flying for the next 20 hours.
To find the answers we need to start by questioning things you've never questioned before. Coaching has always been based on the simple, harmless assumption that skills are something we internalize through repetition, like installing software on a computer, downloading them into our brain and muscle memory. This leads coaches to break techniques down into step-by-step drills, which students practice in isolation before attempting to integrate them into live play. It's a model we see everywhere in sports, from soccer players dribbling around cones to BJJ practitioners drilling techniques on cooperative partners. The hope is that by mastering these skills in a controlled environment, we'll be able to seamlessly transfer them to the chaos and complexity of a full live performance. But what if this traditional approach is fundamentally flawed? What if by training techniques removed from their legitimate context, we're actually creating a weak and fragile kind of skill, one that crumbles under pressure and fails to adapt to the infinite variability of real performance? Bruce Lee famously said, "I fear not the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once, but I fear the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times." It's a powerful quote that also advocates for the traditional approach to skill development, that mastery comes through the repetition of a single ideal technique, and it's a widely accepted truth. Science now disagrees. 20 years ago, a single study should have made us question everything we thought we knew about skill development. Wolfgang Schulhorn designed a study that compared 2 completely different ways of learning the shot put. One group was taught using this traditional approach, drilling a single technique with prescriptive instruction and feedback. The other group took a completely different approach. Instead of trying to perfect a single technique, the second group had to perform different variations every single time, performing 280 different variations over the course of the study without ever repeating a single exercise or receiving any corrective feedback. Schulhorn called this approach differential learning, and the results were astonishing. After just 4 weeks, the differential learning group had improved their throwing distance 3 times more than the traditional group. Even more remarkably, when tested again after 4 weeks of no practice, the traditional group regressed to baseline, but the differential learning group continued to improve. To understand why this works, imagine 2 people learning to navigate to a grocery store, Bob and Hannah. Every day, Bob takes the same route from his house to the store and back. Hannah, on the other hand, is helicoptered into a different random location each day and must find her way to the store from there. Surprisingly, studies have shown that Hannah will likely outperform Bob even when tested on the specific route he's been practicing daily. By navigating from various starting points, Hannah develops a robust, adaptable understanding of the area, whereas Bob's knowledge is weak, brittle, and easily disrupted. In reality, you have never, will never, and could never perform the exact same movement twice, just as you could never walk through a city the exact same way. The philosopher Heraclitus argued this point over 2,000 years ago, famously saying, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he's not the same man." Your body and the environment are constantly changing, so it's impossible to perfectly replicate a movement. This has profound implications for the concept of techniques. If a single person can't perform the same technique twice, how could two different people with different bodies perform the exact same technique? And even if they could, how could it be an optimal solution for the different environments each person interacts with? The brain doesn't store techniques as a set series of actions to be regurgitated. Instead, it explores the vast solution space of how to dynamically coordinate the body to generate the most desired outcome. The more you try to perform the same movement or one movement very precisely, the more you're exploring a small sliver of this vast solution space. It's like retracing your steps, trying to step in the exact same footprints every time. The more you focus on recreating the exact details of a target path, the harder it is to move naturally and efficiently, and the less you learn about the task in general. This is the power of differential learning, the idea that by exploring a wide range of variations, we can develop skills that are flexible and resilient, rather than rigid and brittle. It's a concept supported by a wealth of research across multiple sports, from soccer to golf to volleyball and speed skating. According to Schulhorn, the key lies in a phenomenon called stochastic resonance. Just as a tiny amount of static can help you tune in to a distant radio station, introducing strategic variability into our movements or context can help us hone in on the most critical elements of a technique. This is because the right amount of noise can actually enhance the perception of signal rather than drowning it. It allows us to separate the signal from the noise, to identify the core components of success that remain stable across diverse contexts. In skill acquisition, the signal is key movement information, while noise is meaningless information and the variability or random fluctuations within it. This idea was foreshadowed nearly a century ago by the renowned Russian physicist Nikolai Bernstein. In his groundbreaking study, Bernstein found that expert blacksmiths showed greater variability in their individual joint movements than novices, even as they produced more consistent overall results. The implication was clear. Mastery is not about rigidly reproducing a fixed pattern, but about flexibly coordinating many degrees of freedom to achieve a consistent outcome. Differential learning takes this principle to heart, showing that variability is not a bug, but a feature of skilled performance. By embracing noise and variation as essential parts of the learning process, we unlock a vast expanse of potential solutions, ready to be deployed at a moment's notice. So, while the traditional wisdom may advocate for practicing one kick 10,000 times, the science of differential learning suggests that true mastery may lie in practicing 10,000 variations of one kick. Who do you think would know more about beer? The man who drank one beer 10,000 times, or the man who drank 10,000 beers once? That's a paradigm shift that challenges us to rethink the very nature of skill acquisition, and it's just the beginning. To fully understand the revolution happening in movement science, we need to explore a cutting-edge method that stands a class above all the hacks of the skill development world, and it's called the constraints-led approach, or CLA. In 2018, researcher Rob Gray decided to put the CLA to the test against traditional instruction. He recruited experienced baseball players and placed them in a high-tech virtual batting cage that tracked their movements 120 times per second. He then divided them into 3 groups. I'll use an example to demonstrate. Imagine I'm teaching you a precision jump from parkour. I want you to start with an elastic movement downwards, swinging your arms back and behind you Then, as explosively as possible, I want you to focus on extending your hips, knees, and ankles as you swing your arms back up so that each joint finishes the movement at the same time as you leave the ground. As you travel through the air, I want you to bring your knees in towards your chest and then land the ball of your foot quietly on the edge of this object. Then, as you practice, I would give you corrective feedback to fix any deviations you made from what I imagined to be the ideal precision jump. Gray's traditional group received coaching like this from national level expert hitting coaches. Now, imagine if I tried to coach you to that same ideal technique, except instead of focusing on the triple extension of the ankles, knees, and hips, I gave you cues that focus on the external effects of your body movements. For example, if I told you, I want you to focus on landing the sole of your shoes on the edge of the object, or try to land quietly. Over 50 studies have shown this approach to be superior to the traditional body movement focused cues from the previous example in almost every situation and metric you could imagine. Gray's external focus group used these sort of cues to coach the players towards an ideal technique. Now imagine that instead of that long series of steps, I gave a very clear task with rules to follow. I want you to start behind this line, and without touching anything in front of that line, I want you to land on this object and balance for 3 seconds without moving. I haven't given you any precise instructions of what to do, but I've given you some rules that constrain your actions. I want you to learn to jump, so I provide you with a task and rules that make jumping an appealing solution to the problem. Then I can modify the constraints from the task, environment, or individual to help you develop the skills or capacities that might be important for you to develop. We call this the constraints-led approach. And in the study, Gray's CLA group was simply tasked with hitting the ball over an adjustable virtual barrier, receiving no other instruction or feedback. The results were stunning. The CLA group significantly outperformed both the external focus and traditional coaching groups, armed with nothing more than the simple goal of clearing the barrier. Gray followed up in 2020 with another baseball study. This time, he put the CLA, differential learning, and traditional instruction head to head. The differential learning group improved their hitting by 44% more than the prescriptive instruction group, which in turn beat the no training control by 80%. However, the CLA group, who performed just 3 tasks designed to encourage opposite field hitting, came out on top, outpacing even the differential learning group by 15%. These findings are just the tip of the iceberg. A growing body of research across various sports consistently validates the superiority of the CLA and differential learning for motor learning, retention, creativity, and load reduction in sports ranging from tennis to volleyball, golf, soccer, futsal, shot put, and equivalent results in weightlifting. The CLA's effectiveness is rooted in a framework that is redefining our understanding of how skills are developed and optimized. This approach views skill acquisition as an emergent property of the complex interaction between the performer, the environment, and the task at hand, rather than something we internalize through repetition. By carefully manipulating the constraints of the task, individual, and environment, the CLA creates learning experiences that tap into the natural, self-organizing tendencies of the human movement system. This allows skills to develop in a way that's deeply attuned to the demands of real-world performance. This process of self-organization and adaptation might follow an interesting pattern. Lee et al. 2014 found that while a traditional group showed greater improvements in movement form when learning a tennis stroke, the CLA group demonstrated more varied movement solutions at post-test. However, at a 4-week retention test, the traditional group exhibited more solution variability, while the CLA group showed less. This suggests that the CLA may promote initial exploration, followed by a pruning of solutions, whereas traditional methods may constrain solutions toward an ideal technique in the short term, but lead to a loss of that prescribed technique over time. This could explain why the CLA and differential learning often lead to continued skill gains at retention, while traditional groups tend to regress. For you to understand why the ecological approach is so much more powerful for skill acquisition, you need to understand what it is and how it differs from the traditional approach. This is why I've spent the last 16 months reading thousands of pages of textbooks and scientific articles and talking to as many experts as possible so that I can make like Einstein and make this as simple as possible, but no simpler. Here's my best shot. Imagine a camera which has a sensor that receives light, a processor, and a screen that shows the image. We could assume the light coming to the sensor can't perfectly represent all the objects in front of the camera. And the sensor also can't perfectly represent all the light that hits it. So the processor has to do all sorts of work to fix the noise from the sensor, potentially fill in missing pieces of information, and turn this digital information into an image. The information processing model assumes the body is essentially a very smart computer, and that this is how we sense the world around us. Most scientists still fall in this camp, and they think that we receive incomplete and noisy sensory information from the environment, that our brain processes and fixes this bad information using stored information, and uses that to create a representation of the world around us. They think that we actually perceive our representation of the world rather than the world itself. Then, if you wanted to stand up, throw a ball, hit an armbar, or perform any action whatsoever, you would cognitively choose this action from a menu of stored motor programs relevant to your perceived representation of the world. This motor program would contain modifiable instructions from your brain that would then tell each of your muscles exactly what to do. That's why in this model, it makes sense that we would spend so much time having people perform what we believe are correct solutions over and over and teaching them when they should use them. Because skill in this view is about internalizing optimal techniques that can be recalled from a library of stored moves. Notice how in this approach, everything important happens in the performer. We perform an action, perceive changes in our representation of the world, then perform another action. In this model, not only does the performer passively receive information from the environment is basically a receiver for the actions of the performer, just like how big oil companies think of the ocean. In ecological dynamics, almost everything is wildly different. Ecological comes from the relative emphasis on the environment. Here, not only are we going to consider the environment just as important as the performer, we are going to consider the performer-environment complex as the fundamental unit of analysis, and that we can't understand the actions of the performer in absence of their environmental context. Dynamics comes from nonlinear dynamical systems, which we use to explain coordination. This is going to sound a little crazy, but here we're going to think about the environment as filled with various forms of energy, like light, sound, and pressure, that are functionally perfect. They tell us everything we need to know for the coordination of movement if we just know where to look. See, this is the idea of James Gibson, who came up with ecological psychology. Many of the best ideas in this field are originally his, but I'm going to explain using a brilliant analogy from his colleague, Sverker Runeson. In the information processing model, neurons function like transistors, processing all that raw sensory information to find patterns within the energy arrays by having a huge number of things, each doing simple tasks. Runeson calls these rote perceptual instruments. That makes sense to scientists because we can understand computers, but there is no reason evolution would have to land on a solution to the problem of perception and coordination that's easy for us to understand and replicate. Runeson says that we have smart perceptual instruments, which are specialized to take shortcuts and get straight to important business. For example, imagine two people asked to calculate the area of a rectangle. One has a ruler which represents rote perceptual instruments, and the other has an interesting device that I have here called the polar planimeter, which represents smart perceptual instruments. The person given the ruler must measure the length of the rectangle, then the height, and then use stored information about geometry and mathematics to know that they must multiply these two to find the area. The person with the planimeter, on the other hand, can use its mechanical peculiarities to measure the area of any two-dimensional shape just by tracing it. No calculations or knowledge necessary, and they can do so quickly, simply, and accurately. On the other hand, if you ask them for the length of the shape, they would struggle. The planimeter isn't built for that, and so they would have to compensate cognitively, which would cost them time and accuracy. The idea is that we are just like the person with the planimeter, equipped with a huge variety of smart perceptual instruments. We can test our accuracy in measuring simple geometric properties like length and width, imagining that they are the foundation for more complex and important physical properties, which are foundational for calculating our action possibilities. We aren't very good at this, so we could conclude that we fill those gaps by using stored information and inferences. But it may very well be that we are bad at this because we don't do it in the first place. Gibson proposed the idea of affordances, which Julia Blau and Jeff Wagman define as opportunities for behavior that emerge from the relationship between animal and environment. They explain further here.
Affordances are animal dependent. They depend on you and your geometry and your abilities. They are constantly changing. They're sort of amorphous. They change shape all the time. And so, that's why these units that are animal independent don't work. There are no units that can measure affordances that don't include the animal.
Human behavior is entirely predicated on affordances. Can't do a thing without them. So it's the thing we study. Our perceptual system has to be good enough to do the job we do. So why are we focusing on the ways in which it falls short of things we made up? We made up mass, we made up length.
That is the key for me.
Right.
That evolution would not have developed perceptual systems that are sensitive to units that we created.
We just invented.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because time, we invented. Space, we invented. They were conventions as a way of describing a natural universe. But why would that be what we evolved to perceive? Instead, we need to perceive, I can eat that. That thing can kill me. I should run. I can hide there. That looks like somebody I want to mate with. That's what we need to be able to perceive.
So in ecological dynamics, organisms are existing within a field of relevant affordances, or opportunities for action that individual organisms perceive in particular situations. That is in the context of a wider landscape of affordances, which are the many affordances available in a particular form of life, like submission grappling. Then, movement patterns are seen as a dynamic, functional relationship between the interacting constraints of the task, environment, and performer, like the patterns that are made when you mix inks and water, rather than pictures that are recreated from memory. Here's an example to put it all together for you. Imagine you're a top player attempting to pass the guard. In the traditional approach, the passer's eyes gather optical information just like the sensor on the camera. The information is fundamentally incomplete, and the sensor itself is fundamentally imperfect and noisy. That information is gathered and projected onto the retina to form a retinal image. Then it travels to the brain, where it and all the other sensory information is gathered, processed, and corrected to form a representation of the environment and the guard player within it. The brain then uses that information to generate a relevant action menu of stored general motor plans. In this case, imagine there's sketches of all the different guard passes you know, like toreandos, leg drags, etc. Then you choose an action from that action menu, say a toreando, and start following that action until your body senses a deviation from what your brain expects based on memories of the last time you did a toreando. The environment changes due to your action and during your action. During the action, you perform course corrections from deviations, and after the action, the cycle repeats in the loop we call perception-action coupling. If this is how it all works, then it makes sense that we should be spending our time teaching and learning how to cognitively process that information and refining those general motor programs like knee slides and leg drags. If that's all a bit much, just think in information processing, it's as if your brain is playing your body like a video game, repeatedly rendering the environment, creating a stored action menu, selecting an action from that menu, and telling your body parts all exactly what to do based on that stored action plan. In the ecological approach, you, the top player, are equipped with a wide variety of smart perceptual instruments that directly sense your action possibilities in the environment without any need for processing or computation. You aren't going to recall any of those actions from memory. Instead, you'll be navigating a felt sense of tension. You don't want to be in front of their guard. You want to be on their back in a rear triangle, and your body will be dynamically coordinating to move towards that situation as their body is dynamically coordinating to put you in a rear triangle. While we can obviously make cognitive decisions, the ecological approach sees movement as a dynamic interplay between the perceiving, acting, and cognizing of each performer and the environment, which are all inseparable. So at any point, you might perceive the ability to put your partner's back on the mat or get around their legs by doing a movement people would call a toreando pass. But you don't have to choose it any more than you would have to choose to lift your feet when you walk. And the information needed to tell you whether or not you can do any of these things is directly present within the patterns of stimulation of your sensory systems in organism relative units like tau. Further, the toreando pass you might do is just a snapshot of one way the performer-environment interaction might play out, just like how we can take a snapshot of the complex interaction between mixing inks, but it has little relevance to the overall dynamics of how they mix. This is a radical departure from the traditional view. In ecological dynamics, perception, action, and cognition are deeply intertwined and mutually informing, with perception directly guiding action and action shaping perception, while cognition both affects and is affected by both in a continuous Mobius strip. The information specifying affordances is not something that needs to be processed or inferred. It is directly available in the performer-environment complex, waiting to be picked up by the attuned organism. This idea of direct perception and the specification of affordances in the environment has profound implications for our understanding of skill acquisition and expertise. It suggests that the key to skilled performance is not the accumulation of mental representations or the execution of pre-planned motor programs, but the development of a deep attunement to the information arrays that specify the affordances of the performance environment. Skilled performers in this view are not those who have stored a vast library of techniques or strategies in their minds, but those who have learned to pick up on the most relevant information for their goals and calibrate their actions to the ever-changing demands of the environment. This is a perspective that places the performer-environment relationship at the center of skill acquisition and has revolutionized how many of the most advanced movement scientists think about teaching, learning, and performing in a wide range of domains since its inception in the late 90s. According to researchers in ecological dynamics, we gain skill through the cultivation of three critical areas: attention, intention, and calibration. First, let's consider attention. As Dr. Tim Ingold eloquently puts it, education is about attending to things, rather than acquiring the knowledge that absolves us of the need to do so. About exposure, rather than immunization. In the ecological dynamics approach, we assume that the environment and the information arrays it provides already contain all the information we need for skillful action. We don't need to consciously process this information. Rather, our perceptual systems are attuned to direct the critical variables directly. However, the challenge is that these critical variables are often hidden within vast arrays of information. Hence, a key component of skilled performance is learning to attend to the most relevant sources of information for a given task. A powerful example of this comes from the world of tennis. Andre Agassi once lost 3 consecutive matches to his rival, Boris Becker, whose serve he described as unlike anything the game had ever seen. But after studying hours of footage, Agassi noticed a subtle cue.
And I started to realize he had this weird tick with his tongue.
Becker would often stick his tongue out just before serving, inadvertently signaling where he was about to place the ball. Armed with this insight, Agassi went on to win 9 of their next 11 encounters, saying that the hardest part
Wasn't returning a serve. The hardest part was not letting him know that I knew this.
it wasn't till years later, after they both retired, that Agassi finally told Becker his secret.
We went out in Oktoberfest in Germany and had a pint of beer together, and I couldn't help but say, by the way, did you know you used to do this and give away your serve? He about fell off the chair. He says, I used to go home all the time and just tell my wife, it's like he reads my mind.
By educating his attention, Agassi gained a decisive advantage. As Rob Gray puts it, learning and skill is about picking up information from your environment. It's not about the knowledge stored in your head. The radio signal is not in the radio. Just as we can pick out our name being spoken in a crowded room, skillful performers learn to detect the most critical information amidst the noise, even if it's as subtle as the twitch of a tongue. While attention allows us to pick up relevant information from the environment, intention guides how we act upon that information to achieve our goals. Intention is about perceiving and selecting the most relevant goals based on the affordances of the environment and pursuing the most effective movement strategies to achieve them. It's about forming the right kind of movement solutions for the right goals within a given task. For example, novice golfers tend to putt the ball further by increasing the velocity of their backswing, while skilled golfers do so by increasing the amplitude. This is an instance of skilled intention, not just doing something differently, but doing something different altogether to achieve a more effective outcome. Finally, calibration is the process of fine-tuning the relationship between our intentions and our actual movements. It refers to the ongoing refinement of our movement information couplings to more closely match our intended strategies based on the feedback we receive from our own bodies and the environment. This feedback is not always explicit or conscious. It's subtle and implicit. And skilled performers learn to attune to these subtle signals to continuously adjust their movements. Through calibration, we translate our intentions into physical reality with increasing precision and effectiveness, enabling us to achieve our goals more consistently and effectively. Rob Gray offers a helpful analogy here. In the traditional information processing view, the brain is like a CEO micromanaging every employee in the company, dictating every muscle's every move. This is why coaches often use internal focus cues, directing attention to the movement of specific body parts, essentially telling the CEO to tell the triceps to extend the elbow. But as Gabrielle Wolf and colleagues have shown across over 50 studies, those internal focus cues consistently degrade performance. They lead to less force output even with more muscle activation, less accuracy, less endurance, worse balance, and crucially, less learning. The wisdom of this was captured by William James back in 1890. He said, "Keep your eye at the place aimed at, and your hand will fetch the target. Think of your hand, and you will likely miss your aim." When we focus on an external goal, our body self-organizes to achieve it, just as a company's employees coordinate to fulfill the CEO's vision. Micromanaging individual components only disrupts this natural coordination. This is where the constraints-led approach shines. Rather than prescribing a long list of technical cues for the athlete to internalize, the CLA sets up a representative learning environment with a specific problem to solve. This allows the athlete's system to self-organize and discover the movement solutions that work best for them without the interference of excessive instruction. The coach's role then is not to dictate solutions, but to guide the athlete's attention to the most relevant information sources and to design tasks that challenge them to continuously improve their fit with the performance environment in important ways. By cultivating attention, intention, and calibration through the constraints-led approach, athletes can develop adaptable, resilient, and context-sensitive skills that are finely tuned to the demands of real-world performance, without the need for explicit instruction or attentional focus cues. In ecological dynamics, we view the body as a complex, nonlinear dynamical system composed of many interacting subsystems. These systems and subsystems influence each other in intricate, nonlinear ways, meaning that small changes in one component can lead to disproportionately large effects elsewhere, while large changes might have surprisingly minimal impact. This nonlinearity is a key feature of complex systems, as described by chaos theory, another foundational field for ecological dynamics. The famous butterfly effect encapsulates this idea. A butterfly flapping its wings could, through a complex chain of interactions, contribute to the formation or prevention of a tornado thousands of miles away. We can see this principle in action with a simple set of double pendulums. Starting them in almost the same way leads to completely different behavior in just seconds. In the context of the human body, this means that various joints, muscles, and all physiological systems are not rigidly controlled by top-down commands from the brain, but rather self-organize in response to the demands of the task and the constraints of the environment. For example, when bones or muscles are subjected to mechanical loading, they adapt and grow stronger through processes like hypertrophy at the cellular level. This adaptation occurs without conscious direction from the brain, and indeed, we are not even aware of it happening. Of course, motor commands do originate in the brain and are transmitted via the spinal cord to motor neurons, which in turn stimulate muscle fibers to contract. But the brain does not micromanage the myriad details of this process. Just as precisely which muscle fibers are innervated by which motor neurons, the contraction speed, fatigue resistance, force production, pronation angle, metabolic profile, and so on. Nor does the brain control how these local changes affect more distant body parts through the interconnected network of fascia. Those characteristics, and so many more, are all controlled at the local level. The brain, rather than micromanaging every detail, sets the overall goals and priorities for the movement system, and is merely an important player on a larger team. The complex neuromuscular and physiological subsystems then self-organize to achieve these goals, adapting to the constraints of the task and environment. For example, we usually think of the body like this puppet, where the nervous system is the strings and the brain uses those strings to make the body do whatever it wants. But watch this. If I set these metronomes on the table, they will all run on their own time. But if I set this system up the right way, with these metronomes connected by this cardboard suspended on these cans, all 5 of these metronomes will spontaneously synchronize, no matter how I started them. In ecological dynamics, we think the brain is much closer to the cardboard platform, a connector and integrator of different systems, rather than the puppet master itself. That's why this paradigm leads us to a completely different teaching methodology, and also why people saying that this is just another way to cook the same fish just don't get it. If the fundamental nature of the human movement system is self-organization, we can still use explicit details here and there, but why would you waste your time prescribing precise details of a specific movement when I can't even tell my body exactly what to do in the first place? This understanding of the body as a self-organizing system has profound implications for how we approach teaching and practice. Traditionally, the focus has been on reproducing specific movement forms, with the assumption that if we can just get the technique right, the desired function will follow. However, ecological dynamics allows a totally different approach. Rather than obsessing over the precise aesthetics of a movement, we can instead focus on creating learning environments that directly develop the underlying function. A powerful example of this comes from my own experience teaching forward rolls. I had already moved beyond a rigid one-size-fits-all approach, encouraging students to explore variations and apply the roll in different directions and situations. I worked with the concept of a movement sleeve, acknowledging that a particular movement solution can have a range of acceptable variations. With this approach, my students learned quickly. Consistent practice allowed them to develop a high level of skill within a month or less. However, by shifting my focus from refining a specific technique to creating environments that challenged my students to solve the problem of falling safely, I saw a quantum leap in their progress. Not only did they learn faster, but they also broke free from the constraints of any one ideal form. They began to exhibit a vast increase in creativity, discovering novel acrobatic solutions that went beyond what I had previously thought possible. Once, I very nearly cried tears of joy in the middle of class as I watched every single student execute brilliant new movement solutions of the caliber that I didn't expect them to be capable of in this lifetime. Who is more skilled? The person that can automatically perform a set series of steps in a controlled environment, or the person that can dynamically create the most effective solution for the problem in front of them to reach their goal? Here's what happened when I taught the forward roll using a more traditional technique-focused approach. And here's what happened when I applied the CLA. The CLA allowed students to tap into their own unique movement potential, finding and exploring solutions that were optimally tailored to their individual characteristics and the demands of the task. They developed a deeper understanding of the principles underlying safe falling, rather than simply memorizing a specific form. As a result, they were better able to apply these principles in novel situations and adapt to the inherent variability of real-world challenges. By recognizing the self-organizing nature of the human movement system and focusing on the development of function rather than the reproduction of form, we can create learning environments that foster adaptability, creativity, and deep understanding. The result is a level of performance and skill acquisition that far surpasses what is possible through a more traditional technique-centered approach. Of course, this doesn't mean that technique is irrelevant or that any movement solution is as good as any other. Skilled coaches and practitioners can still use their expertise to guide learners towards more optimal solutions. But the key is to do so by manipulating the constraints of the learning environment and directing the learner's attention to relevant information, not by prescribing rigid movement forms or micromanaging the details of execution. The shift from a technique-centered to a function-centered approach may seem subtle, but its implications are profound and far-reaching. And teachers, I know how much hard work we have all put into finding and refining the best techniques for our students. But honestly, who cares if our students use our idealized solutions? What we all really want is for our students to have success solving the real-world challenges they are going to face. And in BJJ, this method is far better suited for that. The evidence suggests that ecological dynamics approaches offer numerous advantages over traditional methods. They lead to greater progress in every study, sometimes dramatically so, despite tests often being too narrow to fully capture the advantage gained. Most studies are doing the equivalent of testing Bob and Hannah only on the path Bob practiced every day, not the many variations Hannah experienced or tasks in representative, information-rich game environments. They result in greater retention of learning in nearly every study. In the few cases where explicit instruction initially outperformed ecological approaches, those advantages were wiped away by a dramatic advantage in retention from the ecological approach. It's like the difference between never forgetting how to ride a bike and quickly forgetting the password for your bike lock. Ecological dynamics trains the system to organize more intelligently, rather than memorizing a series of explicit instructions. CLA groups have a higher focus on task goal, even compared to external focus groups. It's very autonomy supportive and makes it easy to avoid internal cues, aligning well with the evidence for optimal theory. Ecological dynamics approaches are more robust to technical variation, environmental variation, and competitive pressure. Pressure often leads to choking through a micromanagement of your own movements, but the ecological approach combats this with a more inherent focus on task goals. Moreover, since you aren't learning to perform techniques in a rigid step-by-step manner, you don't have to worry about remembering and executing them correctly under the pressure of a live game, leading to greater reliability of skill. If you're familiar with pain science or you've watched my videos about it, you know that pain is a very complex multifactorial issue. However, in some studies, ecological approaches have been associated with greater reductions in load markers that were associated with injury risk. Ecological dynamics paradoxically allows students to develop better and more creative solutions by not teaching them solutions. Orangi 2021 meticulously recorded the actions performed by soccer players after 12 weeks of training. They found that players who trained using the constraints-led approach, given no instruction or feedback on specific movement techniques, performed a significantly greater number of different actions, and 2.5 times more rare effective actions than the traditional instruction group. Based on the theories and evidence supporting ecological dynamics, we can expect several implications I've experienced that haven't directly been proven yet or have only been shown in a few studies. Ecological dynamics should lead to higher transfer from training to sport due to representative design, as more similarity to real game and sport performance is a key criterion for methods in the ecological approach. Ecological dynamics also allows us to better understand and address variations in performance, particularly when it comes to transferring skills to different environments. Ecological dynamics emphasizes the importance of representative learning design, where practice tasks closely resemble the demands and variability of the performance environment. Traditional approaches like passive drilling in jiu-jitsu, dribbling around cones in soccer, hitting against pitching machines in baseball, or shooting with no defender in basketball strip away the contextual information athletes need to adequately prepare themselves for the challenge they face in competition. Further, this failure to account for the complex, dynamic nature of real performance is a fundamental flaw in traditional training approaches. It's not enough to simply reproduce the mechanical characteristics of a skill. Athletes must learn to attune to and interact with the information-rich environment in which those skills are deployed. And coaches who don't understand this will be severely limited in their ability to design effective practice environments. Ecological dynamics should require less time for instruction and place less demand on students' working memory, allowing for more practice. The work feels more focused and beginner-friendly at all levels. It facilitates rapid iteration and refinement of techniques in the real world. You find and fix the weakest links immediately and waste no time whatsoever with the techniques that don't work or don't work for you, because you aren't spending any time learning particular techniques anyway. This may sound like it simply saves a bit of time, but the reality is millions of people waste years of their lives training martial arts that are martially incompetent. And simply by embracing the CLA and eschewing their techniques, these disciplines would be completely reforged into far more potent expressions. Teachers can never fully grasp the intricate, ongoing dynamic information athletes get on their body's state, affordances, and limitations. In traditional approaches, this can be a catastrophic problem for bad coaches and a slowdown for great ones. But with ecological dynamics, this problem gets flipped on its head as we give the athletes the autonomy to use that information to dynamically dictate their solutions, even in training. Ecological dynamics empowers athletes by giving them the autonomy to explore and discover solutions that leverage their unique strengths and attributes. Unlike traditional coaching methods that struggle to account for the rich, ever-changing tapestry of information that athletes perceive from their bodies and the environment, ecological dynamics harnesses the power of self-organization and guided exploration. This allows athletes to dynamically adapt their behaviors to the demands of the moment, using their individual capabilities to find personalized solutions. By recognizing that the path to expertise lies in learning to perceive and exploit the unique opportunities for action tailored to each athlete, the ecological approach enables an athlete-driven learning process that traditional one-size-fits-all approaches simply cannot match. This video wouldn't be complete without addressing some potential criticisms and limitations of ecological dynamics. While many critiques stem from a misunderstanding of the words ecological and approach put together, there are some valid concerns worth discussing. From an academic perspective, I'm not entirely convinced about the degree of richness of our environment's perceptual information, and the role of cognition in movement and learning seems incompletely resolved within ecological dynamics. When it comes to practical application, the ecological approach is often physically demanding, and its emphasis on representative environments, if not implemented carefully, could lead to a higher risk of injury. Further, this representativeness may cause further complications. For example, representativeness in BJJ means working against real resistance, which means more work and much more sweat in every class. That sweat can then carry infectious material between people and spread them across the mats. Skin infections are a complex multifactorial issue. Representativeness is the priority for skill development, but it may create non-intuitive safety concerns that coaches must become aware of. Coaches must strike the right balance between challenging athletes and ensuring their safety. And if you implement the CLA for no-gi jiu-jitsu, I implore you to find ways to reduce the amount of sweat on the mats, such as fans, dehumidifiers, and the cleaning and drying of mats between classes. Another potential pitfall is that athletes might develop a degree of technical apathy. It's often easier to engage athletes when they believe there's one right way to perform a skill. Telling them that techniques are context dependent and should be individualized can sometimes dampen their enthusiasm for studying the intricacies of their sport. Moreover, while poor coaching in traditional methods might waste athletes' time, unskilled application of ecological dynamics could lead to athletes reinventing the wheel, or worse, failing to develop fundamental skills altogether. The learning process could be hindered without the appropriate guidance and constraints. Transferring cognitive knowledge can also be more challenging without explicit instruction, which might be a drawback in some situations. However, while all the research I've read showed that the CLA with zero feedback or explicit instruction beats explicit instruction, that's mostly for scientific purposes of comparison. There's no rule in ecological dynamics against giving some explicit details or cues here or there, especially when students are struggling. We simply have to remember the heavy limitations of explicit instruction, and that even the clearest, simplest details are not solutions to be copied so much as areas to search. Additionally, the theoretical complexity of ecological dynamics might deter some coaches from fully embracing it, as it requires a significant shift in thinking about skill acquisition. As Max Planck once wrote, "A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it." Whatever the CLA's advantages over prescriptive instruction in BJJ, I suspect it will be smaller for expert players, since high-level athletes learn to tune out inhibiting instructions or details, and copying solutions will be far more effective for the athletes skilled enough to actually apply those solutions against resistance. Finally, ecological dynamics approaches might not be the best fit for sports that prioritize specific aesthetic criteria, such as gymnastics. In these cases, where how an athlete does something is actually an important part of the sport, more prescriptive instruction may yield better results. Despite these limitations, I believe that for most function-oriented complex sports, adopting an ecological dynamics approach will be the single most productive change most coaches ever make. While explicit instruction has its place and often outperforms no training control groups in research, it's like digging a hole with a chisel compared to the shovel of ecological dynamics. The chisel might be better to make the hole look a certain way, but the shovel is far better for digging. Use the tool that best fits the task at hand. You might be wondering why we seem to discard the notion of techniques and formalized responses, a cornerstone of how we traditionally view movement in ecological dynamics. The key lies in the concept of invariance. When we observe an object, the optical information we receive changes as we move or the object moves. However, certain physical properties of the object and the corresponding optical information remain constant regardless of our perspective. These invariant properties allow us to recognize objects and interact with them effectively. In the context of sports, rather than focusing on specific techniques, ecological dynamics encourages coaches to identify and work with the invariant properties of those techniques. For example, in BJJ, there are countless different variations of the armbar, but the invariant property across all of these variations may only be to connect to the shoulder and straighten the arm. By focusing on creating these invariant properties, rather than trying to replicate exact movements that tend to create them, athletes directly develop the things that they actually need to succeed, and hence do so far more effectively. It's important to recognize that ecological dynamics is not a shortcut or a way to avoid the hard work of coaching. In fact, it requires just as much, if not more, depth of understanding as traditional approaches. The difference lies in the focus. Rather than memorizing an ever-expanding tree of techniques and counter-techniques, ecological dynamics requires coaches to understand the underlying causes and effects, and effectively guide athletes' attention and intention. Effectively implementing ecological dynamics requires skill and creativity in designing suitable tasks. Athletes will inevitably find ways to exploit or circumvent the constraints you put in place. So it's essential to create challenges that keep them honest and force them to work hard for their achievements. In adversarial sports like martial arts, one effective strategy is to design zero-sum games, where one athlete's success comes at the direct expense of their partners, largely preventing them from gaming the system. Consider the example of escaping a front headlock in Brazilian Jiu-jitsu. A beginner might not know how to escape at all, while an expert could demonstrate several counters for each variation of the hold. Through an ecological dynamics lens, the focus is on the key invariant factors: separating the opponent's hands, uncovering one's own head, breaking grips, maintaining a strong defensive posture, and seeking opportunities to recover guard or return to their feet. The coach's primary role is to educate their athletes' attention and intention, guiding them to recognize and exploit these critical factors in the moment, without necessarily requiring a conscious understanding of specific techniques. This is a crucial point. Athletes don't need to have a deep cognitive understanding of techniques to perform them skillfully. In fact, attempting to consciously process and apply technical knowledge can often hinder performance. Instead, through well-designed tasks and constraints, coaches can guide athletes to develop an intuitive, embodied understanding of their sport. This allows them to respond fluidly and effectively to the ever-changing demands of competition without getting bogged down in the specific details of techniques. By focusing on educating attention and intention rather than imparting explicit technical knowledge, coaches can help athletes develop a more adaptable, resilient, and creative approach to their sport. This is the essence of the ecological dynamics approach, creating an environment that fosters the emergence of skillful, self-organized behavior, guided by the athlete's own perception and action systems. Now, let's see how we can apply this to BJJ. At Standard, they start with a simple definition which serves as a guiding principle for navigating the game. They say, we play the game of immobilization as it leads to strangulation and breaking. We attack the periphery to gain access to the center of mass, then control the center of mass to re-attack the periphery. In Greg's system, there are 3 core situations in BJJ: standing, guarded, and pinning, chest to chest or chest to back contact, and 3 main submission categories: straight locks, twisting locks, and strangulations. The common thread? Establishing and exploiting connections to your opponent. Greg's approach revolves around 2 key task categories. 1, making and maintaining connections, and 2, using those connections to isolate, destabilize, immobilize, or segment. These tasks can be continuous, no-win condition, or terminal, restarting after a goal is achieved. As West Coast Trials winner DeAndre Corbe puts it, continuous games build capacity, and terminal games build capability. In other words, exercises without a specific endpoint develop your ability to maintain a skill or situation over time, while games that reset after a goal is achieved sharpen your ability to execute that skill in the first place. So what does this look like in practice? I developed a series of tasks based on this last year of immersive training and research to serve as a case study in how to apply ecological dynamics to accelerate skill development. There are no perfect one-size-fits-all games, but this combination of tasks is the best starting point I can give you to help you effectively develop fundamental jiu-jitsu skills in every area. For all these games, variation should be injected into the start position using the acronym CAMP. C, the connections between the 2 partners. A, the angle between them. M, any movement or momentum that either player has. And P, the position of each partner, and in particular, the distance between them. Momentum in particular is an important factor that can be often ignored, and it can make these games more dynamic and overall representative of how the game is played. When there's a skill or success imbalance between you and your partner, aim to scale the difficulty first using the camp variables, and if necessary, by restricting the use of body parts so that both partners are appropriately challenged. Don't be scared to stack the odds in your own favor if you start losing repeatedly, or against yourself if you keep winning. Both you and your partner will get more out of it. Game 1, risk control. Our first game is a great example of how the CLA can be used both for skill development and for conditioning. In this continuous game, both partners look to control each other's risks without having their own risk controlled. Try this one as a warm-up at the beginning of a session or as conditioning at the end. For conditioning, 3 to 5 sets of 90 seconds on, 90 seconds off, fully utilizing your grip strength and endurance should work well to help develop them. Game 2, back takes. Both players will attempt to get a secure chest-to-back connection with their partner in a terminal game. Reset after each win and play for 5 minutes. As you play, look to find ways around your partner's head, hands, and forearms to get to the back. Game 3, grip fight to connection. From standing, both players will work to make a secure, closed hand connection anywhere between their partner's armpits and ankles. If you make a connection around a single leg, you need to lift it off the floor to win. If one player gets a headlock and the other has a leg, priority goes to the leg connection. Reset after each win. Most people grip fight with no clear purpose because grip fighting is conventionally taught only in the context of longer sequences of moves. But not anymore. Playing this game for the last year has made an enormous difference in my jiu-jitsu. Game 4. Level change to hips. In this terminal game, start standing at a distance. Both players will attempt to make any meaningful connection between their chest and their partner's hips with an entry from distance. To do this, we'll need to get around our partner's defensive structures, change levels, and close distance. As you play, you may find it helpful to use feints and misdirection. As the girls play here, we'll see a beautiful shift from really struggling with level change to mostly figuring it out in just under a minute and a half with no further instructions. That's clear evidence of self-organization when you know what to look for. In nonlinear dynamics, we call this a bifurcation, a qualitative shift in the intrinsic attractor dynamics. That doesn't need to happen on this time scale for these games to be effective, but it is definitely what we're looking for. Game 5, any takedown. In this terminal game, both players will work to take their partner down to the floor and hold them there for 3 seconds. When in doubt, use the route we've been developing. Use your grip fighting and level changes to work past your opponent's defensive structures and make a meaningful connection to their center of mass. Then use that connection to destabilize them, put them on the floor, and keep them there. For added conditioning, especially in the case of a skill gap between players, try picking your partner back up without their help after each successful takedown. Game 6, control the legs. In this continuous game, we have a top player against a belly-up guard player. Here, the top player will use their hands to make grips on the guard player's legs. Control them such that they only move where and when you want them to, and prevent the guard player from using their legs to make connections. Guard player is only allowed to use their legs, and their goal is to continually break any control and connections made to their legs while simultaneously using their feet to connect to the top player. Switch roles halfway. This game can also be alternated with our first game to develop grappling-specific grip strength and endurance. Game 7, Leandro Lo line holding. This continuous game is dedicated to all-time BJJ legend Leandro Lo. Here we'll have one top player and one seated or belly-up guard player. Top player must stay in front of the bottom player's legs, but they're continuously working to break any connections the guard player makes, prevent them from making meaningful connections, and stay facing the bottom player as much as possible. Bottom player will work continuously to use all 4 limbs to make meaningful connections to their partner and attempt to get and stay behind the top player. Switch roles halfway in. Game 8, passing situation. This terminal game starts in the guarded situation, and both players are looking to significantly advance their position. For the top player, that means you need to get entirely past your opponent's legs, or to the back with both legs covering your opponent's hips, and stay there for 3 seconds. Bottom player needs to sweep, backtake, or entangle to win. For beginners, any entanglement wins, but more advanced players will need an entanglement with their opponent's hip on the floor to win. Both players win by submission at any time. Another hint here is that it's impossible to pin a seated player. So one of your first tasks as a passing player is to get your partner's back on the floor. Game 9, entanglements. Bottom player starts with any entanglement, particularly against a partner who's grounded, up on one knee, or standing up. An entanglement means that we have one of our partner's legs isolated between our legs in any arrangement such that we have a connection above their knee and ideally to their hip. Entangling player will have one of 4 win conditions depending on their level. Level 1 is simply to break down or keep your partner down on a hip and bind their legs together. Level 2 will need to get their partner's legs crossed to opposite sides of their body. Level 3 will capture an exposed heel, and level 4 will need a submission. Entangled player wins by escape to neutral, pass, backtake, or counter submission. Entangled player. When in doubt, hide your heels, don't let them get to your second leg, and work to stand up and remove their connections to you. Game 10, triangles. In this terminal game, one player starts in any triangle, with the other player's head and single arm isolated anywhere within a closed circle of your legs. Attacking player must submit to win. Defending player only needs to escape the triangle with no immediate threat present. Triangles use the strongest part of our body, our legs, against our partner's biggest vulnerability, their carotid arteries. As John Danaher says, the grapplers who learn to grapple using their legs will be the ones who develop the fastest. And this game will teach you to be dangerous with your legs, as well as how to defend and escape triangles. Submissions are often de-emphasized for beginners because the sport values position over submission. But what I've found is that the restricted degrees of freedom in these submission positions allow beginners to explore the smaller solution space more effectively. Each time you win, try to back out of the position, and each time you lose, try to get deeper into the submission for the next round. Game 11, any pin. In this terminal game, top player starts in any variation of any pin, but they need to submit to win. Bottom player needs to escape to neutral seated guard or anything better. As the bottom player, when in doubt, use any space your partner gives you to get your hands, elbows, and legs to the inside, and most importantly, to get your legs back between you and your partner. When they don't give you space, look to destabilize them. Use that destabilization to create space, and use that space to get your limbs back into good position. Game 12, open round. To finish a regular round of jiu-jitsu, starting from the feet can be a great way to integrate all the different things you worked on. Although it isn't necessary to do in every single session, being good at open rounds is different from being good at each isolated game, and it's important to practice the most representative game in the sport. Depending on how far out you are from a competition, or especially if you don't plan on competing, try giving yourself constraints or specific intentions within the open round to develop specific areas. These games are designed to help you develop crucial skills in jiu-jitsu through the constraints-led approach. Focus on experiencing the games, attuning to the task-relevant information, and discovering effective solutions. Embrace these tasks, absorb the underlying principles, and you'll be amazed at how quickly your skills develop. For those who want to go deeper and see more how I design tasks, I've created a comprehensive online course based on my master's research. While these games I've shared here are the best fundamentals that I could cram in this documentary, the full course already contains over 4 hours of carefully designed tasks and sparring footage covering every major area of BJJ, from close guard to entanglements, from standing to submissions, so you can develop a comprehensive grappling skill set and learn firsthand how the ecological approach can be applied skillfully. The games in the course are more refined than what I could show here. They've been developed and tested more as I've learned more reading and training every day. Each task builds on the previous ones with clear win conditions and scaling options for different skill levels. It's essentially everything I've learned about applying ecological dynamics to grappling, structured so you can either train with a partner, small group, or use it as a complete curriculum template. You can find it through the link in the description below. To take this further and start designing your own games with a CLA in any sport, there are 4 key principles that you'll need to know intimately. First, coaches should design each session with an intention in mind, like guiding players towards learning a new skill, developing tactical awareness in a certain situation, or even improving physical preparedness of the athletes. Coaches and athletes must develop a shared intention for and within the practice. Second, coaches should design in constraints that both offer lots of opportunities and create the need for learners to explore the affordances related to the session intention. For example, if we wanted to make our sport interesting by teaching guard pullers takedowns, we probably don't want to do open rounds, since they won't have much need or opportunities for takedowns. Instead, we can constrain rounds to be standing to floor only, which creates both the need for takedowns as well as much more availability for them, and then add further constraints to encourage learners to explore more specific areas as necessary, such as only hand fighting to connections, finishing from connections, switching between connections, or destabilizing our partner. Avoid over-constraining to force specific solutions, and instead invite engagement with specific affordances through exaggeration. Third, rather than doing repetition after repetition, how can we do repetition without repetition? Tasks with too little variability don't support new pattern forming or system reorganization, while tasks with too much variability will become inherently chaotic and unmanageable. We generally want to find the critical amount of variability, just at the edge of chaos. That creates some instability and encourages the search for new solutions. Finally, the most important factor for ensuring that what we learn in practice transfers to what we do in competition is making sure that what learners are seeing, hearing, and feeling is at least similar to their performance environment. Does drilling moves repetitively against a non-resistant partner who is told exactly what to do and when look, sound, or feel anything like a grappling competition? Absolutely not. Does my body use similar information to guide my actions when I repeat those movements for reps or accuracy against an inert training partner and in a grappling competition? Absolutely not. This is an example of a fallacy we call task decomposition. We intended to simplify the task to make it easier for you to perform, and we've done that. But in so doing, we've also destroyed the all-important flow of information to movement that is the entire basis of skilled action in the first place. Change your focus from actions to interactions. And when in doubt, ask yourself, does this practice look and feel similar to the real thing? If not, that practice won't help you much in competition. Many of you will wonder, as I did, how this new approach compares to the methods of other top BJJ coaches. In the landscape of modern jiu-jitsu, one name stands out: John Danaher, a man renowned for his technical mastery, successful athletes, and revolutionary impact on the sport. So, after years of studying Danaher's instructionals, I flew to Austin to experience his teaching firsthand and compare it to Greg's style for this video. Despite their divergent underlying philosophies of movement, I found that classes with both Greg and John shared many key elements that sets them both apart from the BJJ status quo. Traditional jiu-jitsu classes often start with non-specific warm-ups like running in circles and shrimping across the mats. But as a movement teacher, I can tell you these exercises are completely lacking the representative design and perceptual information crucial for skill development in grappling. Both Greg and John skip the warm-up, maximizing valuable class time for actual BJJ practice. John dives straight into techniques with a twist. He often begins by outlining positional principles, goals, and concepts like grip hierarchies, effectively educating intention and attention. In a typical class, we drilled about 5 moves for about 8 minutes each, which is an extremely short amount of time to complete his detailed instruction and practice for both partners. Feedback was given only when requested, and we would move on once a baseline competence was achieved across the room. This was surprising to me, given Danaher's reputation for his meticulous eye for detail.
Watch Gordon Ryan's left elbow.
And the paradigm he's working under. It was surprising that even he wasn't emphasizing perfecting techniques against a non-resistant partner. Greg employed a similar protocol years ago, capping repetitions at 8 per concept, based on research suggesting diminishing returns beyond that point. The key insight they both functionally converged on: extended drilling of techniques against passive resistance is suboptimal. The critical difference, though, lies in the nature of the drilling itself. In John's classes, the level of resistance was minimal, a far cry from the fully resistant opponent that defines the sport. Danaher's students, like my former teammates at Coyote Academy, try to mitigate this deprivation by providing realistic responses for their drilling partners. But it's still quite far removed from the chaos and unpredictability of true competition. It's akin to practicing soccer by dribbling around people who are pretending to be mobile soccer cones, moving in somewhat realistic but ultimately artificial and predictable ways. This approach does, however, provide 2 notable advantages. First, it's far easier on the body, allowing for longer and more frequent training sessions. Second, it allows students to study preconceived movement solutions in a controlled environment. Post-drilling, most BJJ classes jump straight into free sparring. John, however, emphasizes situational training from the positions covered in class. Students work to achieve basic objectives, like points, submission, and escape, resetting upon success. I noticed that technical feedback was quite rare during these rounds. Danaher would observe intently, but limit his interventions to brief chirps of positive reinforcement. How interesting that, again, despite his information processing approach, John is giving his students the space to self-organize. This situational sparring, despite stemming from a different paradigm, shares a crucial feature with the ecological approach: the rapid, iterative learning that comes from repeated exposures against resistance. The tighter focus of situational sparring allows for more targeted skill development. It's like learning chess. You could play full games from start to finish and gradually improve, but your progress would be quite slow. Now imagine if you could pause at critical moments, reset the board, and practice those specific situations repeatedly. That's the power of situational sparring. It breaks down the complexity of BJJ into manageable chunks, allowing you to hone in on the key skills and information. This targeting is the essence of the constraints-led approach, and though their reasons may differ, both Greg and Danaher employ it to accelerate their students' learning. Many people attribute the success of Danaher's students to his unparalleled technical knowledge. However, having been in the room, I believe there's another, more critical factor at play. I don't mean to diminish Danaher's ability as a teacher. There are few people on earth I respect more. He can lecture for hours on the finest details of every move imaginable, painting a vivid picture of the underlying biomechanical and strategic principles. But in terms of his students' success, I would argue that this unparalleled technical expertise is more of a cherry on top of the sundae rather than the sundae itself. The real magic, in my eyes, lies in his ability to create a training culture that encourages and facilitates an incredibly high volume of deliberate resistance-based practice. He personally teaches nearly 50 people who train with him 2 to 3 times per day, 6 days per week, for years on end. All of this with such intensely focused athletes that before class, there's a tension in the room that's almost physical. This, combined with his intelligent use of specific training situations, is far more in line with an ecological dynamics approach than most jiu-jitsu academies. In fact, those situational rounds are as close to the CLA as traditional instruction can get without actually applying an ecological dynamics lens. I argue that progress in grappling is nearly proportional to the time spent working against resistance. Time spent drilling explicit moves without resistance should be put in a lower category of effectiveness for the development of grappling skills, closer to visualization, studying videos, and taking dance classes. This is where the ecological approach truly shines for BJJ. By discarding passive, low-resistance drilling entirely, we ensure that every second of class is maximally devoted to a focused practice against resistance, within a framework optimized for skill acquisition. The result is an unparalleled rate of development per hour. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has risen to prominence as the most effective martial art in the world, with roots tracing back to the early 20th century. The story begins with Mitsuyo Maeda, a Japanese judoka who brought his knowledge to Brazil, where he coached Carlos Gracie. Carlos and his brother Elio took the principles of leverage, timing, and technique from Japanese judo and evolved them into a formidable new style emphasizing ground fighting and submissions. The Gracies didn't confine their art to the dojo. They put it to the test in the most brutal way possible, through vale tudo, Portuguese for anything goes challenges, against fighters of all styles, battling in no-holds-barred contests with minimal rules. Time and time again, the Gracie family proved the superiority of their style, which became known as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. This tradition of real-world testing paved the way for the creation of the Ultimate Fighting Championship in 1993. The early UFCs were essentially modern vale tudo events, pitting practitioners of various martial arts against each other to find the most effective fighting style. Karate, sumo, boxing, wrestling, kung fu, ninjutsu, capoeira, you name it, it was all there. Once again, they all fell before BJJ, with Royce Gracie's dominant victories in the first UFCs propelling the art to global fame. In the present day, BJJ's influence on modern mixed martial arts is undeniable. While specialists from other styles have found success, every serious competitor, regardless of their primary discipline, has a deep foundation in submission grappling. It's no longer a question of whether you need to grapple to succeed in MMA. It's a given. In the jiu-jitsu community, some attribute BJJ's dominance to its philosophy. The lore of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is that it was born as Elio Gracie modified the techniques of Japanese Jiu-Jitsu to work for his weaker and smaller body, and hence that anyone of any size could defeat a larger opponent using Jiu-Jitsu. A beautiful sentiment. But every martial art with any history has beautiful words, poetry, and philosophy associated with it. Most people believe that the techniques of BJJ explain its dominance. The motto of my old academy, home of countless world champions, is technique conquers all. It's true. Skill is more important than size, strength, or endurance. But the first and foremost definition of technique is a way of carrying out a particular task. And that's usually thought of as a very specific way with details. Every serious martial artist believes their discipline's techniques are superior to all others. Whether it's for disrupting chi centers,
place a piece of paper on a wall, punch it for 2 hours without stopping,
using an opponent's force against them, or for preparing special forces for military combat in some country somewhere. The real secret to BJJ's success has always lied elsewhere. BJJ's true power comes from its relentless emphasis on sparring with live, resisting opponents. That's the secret sauce that makes BJJ and submission grappling in general so much more powerful than other martial arts. Our skill development emerges from actually fighting each other in training every day, while they spend half their time working with obedient allies and the other half being a submissive sidekick. We're forging our skills in the crucible of live resistance over and over again. However, even in the BJJ community, there's a persistent misconception that the goal of all this training is to internalize a set of predefined techniques. In reality, when we do live rounds, we're not memorizing moves, nor applying techniques we memorize with the greatest precision our body will allow. We're attuning to the ever-changing information from our environment and opponents, educating our intentions, recognizing opportunities and threats, and adapting our responses in real time. We are solving problems we've never faced before with solutions we've never used before and will never use again. This is the true skill we develop through live training, not the acquisition of techniques, but a deep, embodied inskillment of the principles that allow us to solve new problems in our environment under pressure. So while some focus on collecting techniques, the art's real power lies in developing problem-solving skills through live resistance. By educating our attention and intention through constant exposure to representative challenges, we build skills that transcend any technique collection. And here's the beauty of it. We can keep training this way well into old age without the risk of permanent brain damage that comes with striking-based arts. That means with a little intelligence, we can accumulate thousands of hours of realistic, high-intensity training, constantly refining our skills under pressure. In 2024, the early adopters of ecological dynamics in BJJ are the grappling equivalent of what Tesla was to the automotive industry in 2013. Just as major car manufacturers were aware of electric motors' potential but dismissed their feasibility, the BJJ establishment has largely overlooked ecological dynamics despite its transformative potential. While the rest of the industry clings to traditional training methods, a small but innovative group of coaches all over the world have been quietly revolutionizing how we develop skill. Their pioneering work has given their students a huge competitive advantage. The same advantage Tesla gained by embracing electric technology years before giants like Ford and GM. Over the past decade, as Tesla stock soared by almost 3,000%, traditional automakers saw their shares decline. By the time these giants realized they needed to catch up, they were already far behind. The same pattern is unfolding in the BJJ world. The big academies that fail to adapt risk being left in the dust, while smaller, more agile teams that embrace this approach are poised to dominate. There's a memorable comparison about ecological dynamics as a revolution in movement. It's like a duck versus a platypus. From a distance, they both seem the same. Both swim, have bills, webbed feet, and lay eggs. Some will watch this video and say, there's nothing new here. But if you're a duck expert and suddenly realize these ducks you've been studying for years are actually platypuses, that's a revolution. Ducks are birds that fly. Platypuses are venomous, carnivorous mammals that swim underwater. Studying ducks, you wouldn't think to look underwater, maybe only seeing one jump out every few years and assuming they fly. But upon uncovering this duck platypus conspiracy, you discover a whole new world of information and activity that was always there, just never observed. Similarly, ecological dynamics is a revolution to experts who previously understood movement through the conventional lens of techniques and information processing. Tragically, new methods in sports are often judged not by science, but by what the world champions are doing, often to the detriment of the sport's advancement. There's a story about a gymnast in the 90s who ripped his hand during his first warm-up at Worlds. He went to the bathroom, peed on the rip, covered it in chalk, then stuck his routine and won gold. Afterwards, gymnasts started peeing on rips. Athletes will do anything the winners are doing. Research is inconclusive on whether the CLA is better for beginners or experts. But in BJJ, advanced and competition classes emphasize far more sparring and situational training than beginner classes, and hence are already far more aligned with ecological dynamics principles. Hence, the switch to ecological dynamics will truly shine for the non-competitive BJJ practitioners whose training is currently dominated by prescriptive instruction to such an enormous extent that the traditional approach is almost asinine. Everyone talks about posture and balance, yet they're never truly developed because they're never developed against resistance. Instead, students are expected to perform new, complex moves requiring those attributes against intelligent, often physically superior opponents. Or rather, they're expected to fail, but internalize the movements and somewhere years down the line be able to perform them against some resistance. There are whole populations of people who decide that they want to learn jiu-jitsu to defend themselves, but they don't want to do the sparring or don't take it seriously. And right now, we as a jiu-jitsu community are tricking these people into thinking that they are learning something useful, when the reality is that they are almost completely wasting their time. The BJJ community may have largely overlooked the importance of ecological dynamics so far, but that's changing fast. As more and more grapplers are exposed to the power of this approach firsthand, they quickly realize its superiority. And once they've seen the light, there's no going back. In the late 80s, chaos researcher Leon Glass said, "The way we are thinking about these problems is the way that at some point in the future, people are going to have to think about these problems. That future is here for BJJ. Embrace the insights of ecological dynamics or risk being left behind by those who do. The choice is yours, but the revolution has already begun. And those who hop on board now will be the ones shaping the sport in years to come." But like any paradigm, success depends not just on the methodology, but on how it's implemented. It's been almost 2 years now since I first came to Standard to interview Greg and moved to Rockville, Maryland. In that time, I've learned and improved so much, and this has catalyzed by far the biggest and most productive shift in my teaching career. I finished my master's and did my master's project on ecological dynamics in BJJ, and in March, DeAndre Corbet won the second biggest prize in the history of submission grappling, and the public discourse around the ecological approach for BJJ shifted almost overnight. But I left Standard about a year ago, and I've spent far too much of that time thinking about how or if I should say this. But there was a serious issue with skin infections at the gym while I was there. I got staphed twice and ringworm for months, and many people had it far worse than I did. When I brought it up privately and tried to help solve the problem, the concerns couldn't be addressed constructively. The reality is that people will probably be fine, but skin infections like staph can be very dangerous, and if something serious happened at Standard and I'd noticed the problem, knew better, but didn't say anything in a feature-length documentary, I'd be complicit in it. Leaving Standard was very tough for me personally, but it's not something I've done lightly, and already it started to open up a lot of opportunities and learning for me. For instance, I started training at Groundworks in Bethesda, which has been a really wonderful and supportive community that also uses the ecological approach. The good news is that ecological dynamics is spreading rapidly. There are now gyms using this approach all over the world, and there's even a map to find your nearest ecological gym. If you want to dive deeper into the science, I've put together a comprehensive reading list in the description. From Rob Gray's accessible books to the foundational papers by Gibson, Runeson, and others. Start with Ian Renshaw's recent review for a quick overview, then work your way deeper. The key is to practice what you're learning. Don't just read about ecological dynamics. Discuss it, debate it, apply it. The best way to find holes in your understanding is to explain it to others or defend it in conversation. For coaches wanting to implement this immediately, use tasks, not techniques. Give brief, function-oriented feedback for function-oriented sports. When in doubt, constrain to afford. Use as few constraints as possible rather than as many as necessary. In adversarial sports, keep all win conditions present for at least one player, at least most of the time. For defensive player, the phrase, "or anything better," is your best friend. It ensures both students get much more representative information, not just try to survive. Most importantly, facilitate creativity rather than forcing specific solutions. Next time you want to teach something, rather than giving your students a solution to copy, try turning it into a task for them to solve in a representative environment that preserves the information movement couplings of the real sport, allowing learners to explore and discover their own solutions. Novelty is a powerful catalyst for learning. Avoid precise repetition and embrace variation in your training, especially in the initial conditions of each task. The more varied the challenges, the more opportunities for students to leverage stochastic resonance and develop deep, flexible skill. When observing sports, look beyond the surface level movements that performers are using. Look for invariant properties that create their success or failure. What function did their movement serve or fail to serve, and why? Thank you to my students and channel members, past and present, for helping me get through this incredibly intensive project. By far, the most intense project of my entire life. My friends and coaches who supported me during a difficult transition, my family for supporting me, and Willow Pogue for always being an absolute gem. My rock in every storm, filming all the best footage in this documentary, moving across the country with me, reading me Schulhorn studies in the car, helping me with references until 4 a.m., and listening to Rob Gray with me at night, all so I could pursue this absolutely crazy project and make this documentary as great as I possibly could. I love you, Will.